Hi everyone, hope you're well. I believe I currently have 12 on the call. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes just to make sure that anyone that might just be running a little bit behind is able to join. Hopefully you all know that you're on the early years risk assessment training session. So the purpose of this session has been put together really to be able to give you as much information as we can for writing some of your risk assessments, but more importantly, a bit of the background around what's important, what's reasonable, and how you can practically apply it to being able to put your risk assessments together. At the end of the session today, we will have a question and answer section. So what you will find is that there's a little icon that you'll be able to pop questions into. And I have a very, very wonderful lady called Stephanie who's supporting me today. She's going to just filter some of those questions through. And once I've delivered the session, we'll be able to answer those questions for you, as many as we possibly can. And any that we can't answer, we'll ensure that we're able to get those answers to you at a later date. So the session is early years risk assessment, and I'm just going to share my screen with everybody, and I hope that you'll be able to see it. Stephanie might be able to confirm that I'm doing this and that everybody can see the right thing. So I'm hoping now that everybody should be able to see early years risk assessment support training June 2020. Okay, I think so we're 3 minutes past 4 now, so I think it's logical for us to start. The whole purpose of this course, as I said, is to give a brief overview really around risk assessment and what it's about. And I completely understand that we've got a range of expertise in terms of some of you may have been writing risk assessments for a long time, some of you may have not written a risk assessment in the past. So what we wanted to do is really try and hit that middling point in providing the right amount of information for you, and more so give you a little bit of guidance and support around how do you decide what a risk level is and whether or not you need to do an awful lot about something or whether or not you've got relevant and reasonable controls. First thing I'll do is introduce myself, because that would help. So my name's Lorraine Adamson. I am the Health and Safety Officer at Wirral Borough Council, and my role predominantly is to look after schools health and safety, but I do get involved in some of the council offices, parks, leisure, that kind of thing as well. I've worked in health and safety for, I'm quite sad to admit, almost 20 years now, and have only been with the council actually since January. I worked for Jaguar Land Rover and Boots prior to that as health and safety officers at both of those organisations. So I do have quite a mixed bag of experience with risk assessment, and I'm hoping that I can support you with that. So making a start on the training then, as I've already said, if you have any questions, you'll notice a question box on your screen. You can type any questions in there. Stephanie will publish them and I'll answer as many as I can toward the end of the session. I anticipate this should take probably around half an hour to go through the content of the slides. There is only 13 of them, but I want to try and give as much background and make this as real life as I can for you. And then, as I say, at the end, we've got around half an hour for questions. It may be that we don't have a lot of questions and it'll be less than that. And if it does exceed the hour, what I'll do is answer anything offline that can't fit into the hour. So it just depends really on how many questions we have through. So the objectives for the session today seem to be a bit slow on the slides here, apologies. So I'm going to go through a brief history of risk assessment. Now the purpose of that really is just to give you an overview of what risk assessment is about. Then severity versus likelihood, which will hopefully give you a bit of an indication around how you decide whether something's really going to hurt somebody or whether it's low risk. What is a suitable and sufficient risk assessment? 5 steps to risk assessment. What is reasonably practicable and what does it mean right now? Using associated documents such as individual risk assessments, common challenges, and then common questions. And that really is the content of today. What I'm very mindful of is, because there'll be a varied range of experience within the attendees of this session, is that you may have individual concerns or questions that you want to raise. So again, if you can't do that within the questions box, we are actually recording this session now, and it will be available for you. So if you want to come back or revisit a section or be able to look at a slide, you'll be able to do that afterwards. So I've already gone through this for you. As I say, conversation box, any questions, I'll answer those at the end. The risk assessment, what do we already know? So this is a very brief history. So risk assessment is one of those terms that never exactly really excites people, but the reality is that it is the underlying documentation to be able to say that you've considered anything that may cause harm and controlled it in the best way that you can. So a risk assessment is a suitable and sufficient document designed to highlight hazards that are identified with a particular task. That could be anything from crossing the road to walking down your own stairs at home, and implement practical controls to remove, reduce or control those hazards so far as is reasonably practicable. And I'm going to talk about so far as is reasonably practicable in layman's terms within this session to help you understand a little bit around what that means. Risk assessment comes in a range of different forms. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter whether it's pink, yellow or green. The template, the style, it really doesn't matter. The main thing that you need to have on your risk assessment is 5 points of risk assessment that I'm going to go through in a couple of slides time. And you also need to make sure that you have a scoring system that defines the likelihood of something going wrong and the severity if that happens. Risk assessment is a live document that should be amended and reviewed when anything changes. In my experience, I've seen risk assessments that were completed 10 years ago for tasks that don't even happen anymore. And the reality is that isn't a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. A risk assessment should always contain the reality of what happens today, and it should be, quite frankly, scribbled all over, amended, changed whenever anything changes, so you know that document really reflects the true practice of what's happening. And then each situation needs to be taken in its own merit, which is why generic risk assessment is not something that we're particularly keen on. So the likelihood could be higher or lower, something happening, dependent on the environment, the individual, the location, any of those things really. And reducing likelihood is preferred than reducing severity. So in layman's terms, removing the risk of something happening is better than reducing the severity of an injury. So what does this mean? How do we decide how severe something is or how likely something is to actually happen? So we know at the moment there's a lot of discussion around COVID-19, and that's one of the reasons we've tried to put this on, to be able to provide a real, I guess, simplistic overview of how you as early years providers are able to make a decision about, well what's the likelihood of something happening for an illness that we can't see. To put this into perspective a little bit, what we do know at the moment is we categorically know that worldwide the number of cases of COVID-19 versus the number of people that have passed away as a result of COVID-19 is very different. And what I'm trying to say there is that whilst the infection rate might be very high, the severity of death actually is very low. Now we do know that there are key groups of people that are more at risk, and those key groups of people need to be considered separately and independently to a general risk assessment for what your setting is like. But let's say in this scenario that we have 10 children within a setting. All of those children are not within a clinically vulnerable category, and there has been real communication with parents or caregivers that those children, if they display symptoms, mustn't come into the setting. In that scenario, it's absolutely reasonable to say that the consequence of, if one of those children contacted COVID-19, the consequence would be around the moderate mark. And the reason we can confidently say that is because whilst catastrophic it can be the case, it's so rarely the case with COVID-19 that it's reasonable for us to put it at moderate risk. That's a moderate consequence, meaning that they are very likely to recover from that illness and go on to live healthy and happy lives. If we took this away from a COVID-19 scenario, we could say that if 1,000 people tripped up a step and sustained bruising, then the consequence of that would be, again, moderate. However, if one person tripped up that step and it was a fatality, we wouldn't, because of that 1 out of 1,000, say that we believe that if you trip up a step, the consequence is going to be catastrophic. We would absolutely say that the consequence is going to be moderate. And the COVID scenario fits into that bracket as well. The likelihood, when we're talking about COVID-19, again, what we need to consider is the data that we currently have. And we can only consider the things that we already know. But what we do know is that for children, there seems to be a very, very, very low rate of children that are contracting COVID-19. So as a result of that, from a likelihood perspective, it wouldn't feel right to say that it's very likely that they're going to contract COVID-19, because we know from the information that we have coming through and the data from schools and all of those educational settings that have remained open all throughout the lockdown periods, that actually very, very few children are contacting COVID-19. So it's right to say that actually the likelihood, again, would be unlikely, and even if we place that at fairly likely, we would then be looking at a 3 and a 3. Now, if we went to a 3 and a 3, that takes us to a 9 on our chart in front of us on the screen. That 9 says that it's adequate. So even before we do anything, we believe that there is an adequate risk rating there. So we want to look to improve it if we can, but even without us doing anything, we're comfortable that that would be fairly likely and moderate. Now, what we do know is there are some controls that are a given at the moment with COVID-19, and those things would be, of course, things such as following the 2-metre distance where possible, encouraging hand washing and absolutely hygiene and cleaning standards within your setting. And then we have information around bubbles, which is to say that what we don't have is lots of different people from lots of different groups mixing and touching the same equipment and potentially each other, because you're dealing with very, very young children. It's very difficult to get them to socially distance. So what we know is we can put additional controls in where we have a 9 rating without doing anything. We can start to bring that down to an acceptable rating by including things such as hand washing, social distancing, cleaning, and of course our main overarching, which is that parents are absolutely aware that we don't have somebody coming in if they are displaying symptoms. So I'm going to take this scenario away from COVID now and talk about likelihood for me at the moment. So I am sat in my front room where I seem to be spending my whole life at the moment. So what is the likelihood of me being struck by lightning right now in my front room? I think it's very, very reasonable to say it's very unlikely that that's going to happen, which would be a number 1. However, if I was struck by lightning, we could say that the consequence of that could be catastrophic. So using the chart that we have up on the screen there, we're able to say that it would be very unlikely for me to be struck by lightning, but catastrophic. If we're looking at that, we're absolutely comfortable in being able to say that we're still within an acceptable level. Let's change this a little bit, going back to a point I made before about location. So one thing can change within a setting that suddenly dramatically increases the risk of something happening. The likelihood of something happening. So let's say that my boss suddenly decides he's going to send me to a golf course in Florida, where we know they have a lot of lightning, and we know that it's an open space, and there would be a likelihood that I would be struck by lightning on that golf course. So we are now saying that the consequence remains the same. And that's usually the case with risk assessment, that the consequence will remain, that if it's going to kill you, it's going to kill you. If you're going to get a paper cut, you're going to get a paper cut. That very, very rarely is impacted. But the likelihood suddenly has dramatically increased. And we're going from it being very unlikely for me being struck by lightning in my front room to being actually quite likely to be struck by lightning on a golf course in Florida. Now, because of that, what we're saying is we suddenly need to put more controls in, because the likelihood of something happening has been dramatically changed. So if I move us on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about controls. So I've already talked about likelihood and consequence, and in your scenarios, you are once you've drawn up that conclusion about how likely something is to happen and what the consequence might be, you may need to put controls in place to manage that risk. But how do you know if the controls are suitable or sufficient? And health and safety often has a bit of a bad name for people going above and beyond, and it being people over exaggerating things. Risk is absolutely subjective. Some people feel that jumping off a cliff at a weekend or base jumping or whatever might be is great fun and low risk. Other people would be terrified. This is exactly the same when we put it into a work scenario. So how do we know that we're controlling something in the right way? So are controls suitable and sufficient? So let's go back to my scenario of the golf course. Is it reasonable for me to suddenly say my boss has sent me up to a golf course in Florida and I'm going to be struck by lightning, that actually I can't do it. I can't do that if the risk is too high. Well, yes, the risk is too high, but what we know is I'm needed to do that job. I mean, I would love to be in a golf course in Florida, but unfortunately I'm not. But let's say I absolutely need to be there to do this job. The cost of me not doing it would be catastrophic. So if that was the case, then my boss would absolutely need to put some controls in place to protect me, because it's not okay just to send me out on that golf course to get struck by lightning, but the job needs to be done. So the next question would be, can my boss relocate me to a safer work location to eliminate this risk? Because the first point of risk assessment is remove the risk if you can. So where possible, it removes the risk and should be the first option to explore. However, let's say that can't happen. I still absolutely need to be on that golf course. Can my boss provide me with a shelter to reduce the risk of being struck by lightning? So suddenly I'm not out in the open on that golf course. I have somewhere an office or a tin hut, whatever it might be, maybe not tin, maybe we'll go for wood. That would reduce the risk and provide a reasonable control when I'm working, but my boss would still need to consider how I get to and from that hut. So can my boss provide me with some kind of PPE? Let's say he gives me a pair of rubber sole trainers. The severity of the injury, to reduce the severity of the injury getting to and from that shelter. Well, that would mean that even if I needed to go outside and was struck by lightning, the severity is lowered. But can my boss still ensure that providing the controls above, the risk is lowered so far as is reasonably practicable? The controls are proportionate to the risk, and is there anything else that he can do to reduce that risk? So can my boss implement other procedures? And these procedures may not be things that cost money necessarily, but are things that are reasonable to put in place. So they could be things like training me to make sure that I review the weather before I go out onto the golf course. It could be that he ensures that there is first aid provisions, that there's a lone worker policy, or that there's buddy systems in place so that people know that I'm safe. In doing all of those things, can I do my job? Well, yes, I can. And can I do it more safely? Yes, I can. The thought process in including reasonably practicable steps helps to ensure the assessment is suitable and sufficient. So all of those measures that have been put in place goes through a very clear thought process. Can we remove the risk? If we can't remove the risk completely, can we reduce the likelihood of an injury occurring? And even when we've done that, can we put other measures in place that are reasonable to additionally control that risk? And that is what a suitable and sufficient risk assessment is. I've used a term quite a lot, which is reasonably practicable, and I'm hoping that this will really help you when you're putting risk assessments together. There can be a lot of pushback, especially at the moment, about risk assessment. You have to eliminate all risks. That's not true. You don't have to eliminate all risk. We don't live, unfortunately, in a risk-free world. But it's important to remember that risk assessment has to be reasonably practicable. And this is to say that the cost of the control does not outweigh the risk. In some cases, it's very useful to remember reasonably practicable, as this is a way of showing that you have controlled the risk as reasonably as you can. If we go back to your scoring matrix, if you have something that is scoring 25 and is in that red area and you need to do something and you can't get it away from that 25 number, then absolutely that's something that you need to do more about. However, if you're in that bottom green area, that adequate area within a risk assessment that's acceptable, then you don't need to keep putting controls in that may potentially cost a lot of money and not really give you a lot of gain. You're also not expected to spend £10,000 to control a 5-minute task if other controls are more cost effective to lower that risk to an acceptable or adequate level. There's 5 steps to risk assessment that I talked about. This is the Wirral Borough Council risk assessment template that we use. And this template is really no different to what you will find on any other risk assessment. This is how ours looks. You may have seen it. This is something you absolutely can use if you want to. But it includes 5 key points. And they are identifying the hazards. What is it actually that can go wrong here? Who is it that might be harmed? And in your scenarios, it may well be that that is children that are coming into your settings, and it may well be that you have staff members as well that you need to be considering. Evaluate the risks to decide on precaution. Well, that's actually just quite a posh way of saying what you're going to do about it. How are you going to control this risk? And is the control that you're putting in place reasonable? And is it something that is adequate? Then we have record your findings and implement them. Now, this is a key part of risk assessment because I've seen many over the years, many risk assessments where people have put, for example, we won't do something. But then when you ask, has that been communicated with staff? That's the bit that sometimes is missing. So ensuring that any of those findings that you have in place have been implemented appropriately, either with your teams, or in this scenario, it may well be that you want to communicate some of these things with your parents or carers to say, please ensure that you are aware if your child has a symptom, you mustn't bring them in, you must self-isolate. You documenting that within your risk assessment is a really sound way of being able to say, I have considered this and I've communicated it with the relevant people. And then review your assessment and update it if necessary. Now, at the moment, it may feel that risk assessment is the key topic. It's the key word that everybody is flinging around. But the reality is it's just writing down the things that you'll already be thinking about. Reviewing it is actually acknowledging, I've put something in place, but I feel I can do more. Or actually, I didn't consider that thing to begin with, so now I'm going to add it on. And that's the review element, which again is really a key part of just saying, I'm just checking that I'm doing the right thing. Associated documents with your risk assessment is only really likely to be applicable to those who have staff members. And I forgive me, I don't know if some of the people on this session now or watching it in the future will be people that have staff members within their settings. But I imagine that that is the case. At the moment, we've talked about general risk assessments for welcoming students and staff, children and staff back into the early years settings. However, we need to consider that some of those staff or children may well fall into a category where they need an individual risk assessment for themselves. And that could be somebody that either falls into a vulnerable category. It could be a child potentially with a behavioural issue or with a disability in which they need additional controls. It could be a number of things really that need to be considered for that one person. And if that is the case, there is a document that can be used. It is a council document that we call the M34.1. It's designed to be used for those individuals. And you can add and amend it as situation changes. So it could be that people are suddenly going from working 1 day a week, end up working 5 days a week. It could be that they're doing longer hours, and their situation, their individual situation, means that they need to have any controls for them as an individual written down. That document it will go a long way in being able to demonstrate as an employer that you've considered those additional controls that are required for that person. You can use any individual assessment so long as the controls are recorded. You don't have to use the council one. However, we'd happily share that council document that you can use and amend as you see fit. Okay, so there is a number of questions that we've tried to preempt for this session, and we've done this really to cover off as many things as we could that have been kind of asked of us, mainly from schools, but may well still be relevant for the early years settings. So The first one is, how do we know we have included every hazard? And the answer to that quite simply is you don't. The risk assessment needs to include anything that is foreseeable. So you can foresee that you may have children that come in and you may normally have 20, and you will foresee that you may want to reduce the sizes of the groups or the bubbles that you're using to protect your staff and your children coming into your setting. You are not expected to see into the future, and it's perfectly acceptable to add new hazards to your risk assessments as they arise. As long as you're comfortable that you've considered key hazards at this point and you've controlled them appropriately, then your risk assessment will be suitable and sufficient. The next question is, why do we keep getting updated hazards to add? This goes back to the risk assessments being a live document, where a school or a early years settings identifies a new hazard, and we believe that it may need to be considered at other schools or other early years settings, then we'll share that, because it is absolutely right to raise a potential hazard that somebody may not have foreseen, and we will share those with you as much as we possibly can. For example, if we had one early years settings raise the fact that they have children that they need to dispense medicines to, and they're unsure how they need to do that or in what way they should document it, the likelihood is, if that's come up as a scenario in one early years settings, it will come up in others. So it's right for us to preempt that thought process for you and support you in being able to control those hazards as best you can. Who should I share my risk assessments with? You are legally obliged to share your assessments with your staff. There is also a duty under the Health and Safety at Work Act to share assessments with unions. However, that may not be applicable to the early years settings. If it is something that's applicable to you, you will need to share it with them. Okay, what is the best way to communicate with staff? It's completely and utterly up to you. There's no right or wrong answer to that. As long as you're comfortable that staff have been communicated with and are aware of any action they need to take, then that's fine. The one thing I will say is that risk assessment generally seem to be the best that they can be when it's been the staff doing those tasks that have been talked to and communicated with. Okay. Okay, how often should we review the risk assessments? At the moment, as often as is necessary. You may find that you'll need to do these regularly, because it could well be that you have additional hazards that are being raised, or additional staff members that need additional controls put in their place. The official answer is when anything changes, or at least once a year. But at the moment, I would absolutely be advising that you review these as often as you can, or whenever a new hazard arises. Also, if you feel that you need to put some new controls in. Do I need to show my risk assessment to parents? You're not legally obliged to do this. However, you might want to, as it might erase or ease some of the parental concerns. It may also help the parents to understand what part they play in being able to ensure that you keep your setting as safe as you can. And then finally here is, do I have to have a written risk assessment? Risk assessment has to be written if you have 5 or more employees. However, it's advisable that even if you do not have employees, that you document any controls you have. And if nothing else, that will just help you plan to implement any controls in welcoming children back into your setting. So that is actually the end of the slides that we have in terms of risk assessment, and it is very much a whistle-stop tour really. But I'm hoping that this is helpful to everybody that's attended the session. And what I'm going to do now is just pause for a second whilst I have a look at some of the questions that have been submitted, and then we'll go through some of those questions as well. Okay, so we have a question here that says, how do I record that I've given additional consideration to a member of staff from a BAME background, given that the government research identifies this group may be a greater risk of contracting COVID-19? Do I need to do an individual risk assessment, or being inclusive, record this in the overall risk assessment for the setting? It's a really, really good question. So the BAME question is one that has come up continuously, because there wasn't initially a lot of guidance that had come out. My take on this absolutely would be to include a individual risk assessment for anybody within the BAME community. And really, that would be just the same as if we had somebody that was potentially diabetic or was in one of those other vulnerable categories. Now, it may well be that we don't need to do anything different because the controls may be suitable and sufficient for everybody. But by having that individual assessment, it sparks conversation with that individual. And I think actually in alleviating some of the concerns that that individual may have, it's a really, really good way of doing that. So yes, I would advise having an individual assessment for somebody from a BAME background. I hope that answers that question. At the moment, that appears to be the only question I have. I'll just give it a second and see if anybody else wants to post anything. Okay, no, I'm not seeing any other questions coming through. As I say, if you do have any other questions that you do pop up, you're more than welcome to ask those through any of your SAL meetings that you're having, and they will get back to the health and safety team. We'll do all we can to support you. In the meantime, I really hope that this has been helpful and beneficial for you, and I wish you all the best of luck in reopening your settings and welcoming back the children that I'm sure you've all missed so much. Thank you very much for your time, everybody, and take care.